Off the top. 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 Off the top.
Okay, so we are now roughly 3 weeks from the election, and I feel like that's kind of enough time to take a deep breath, step back, and really try to analyze things. I'm not capable of doing that, so I brought in some help, and the person who is going to help me is my friend, Jennifer Holdsworth. Now, she has coordinated a campaign for Cory Booker's re-election in 2014, New Jersey State Director for Hillary for America in 2016. She served senior staff in New Jersey legislature as a political director for the New Jersey Democratic State Committee. Jennifer also served as campaign manager for Pete Buttigieg's run for Democratic National Committee chair. And if that's not enough, she still finds time to be a contributing guest on networks like Bloomberg TV, Hill TV Live, and Fox News, where she fights the good fight for her fellow Democrats behind enemy lines. Let's check out a clip.
Jennifer, was that appropriate? Is that something you think is all right?
Well, I can't speak to firsthand knowledge of what happened, but to me, that sounds wildly inaccurate from the story that was relayed to me multiple times. I know Governor O'Malley. I know that he's passionate about what he was talking about. If this administration can't take being spoken to about their policies that are hurting people,
Jennifer,
then I suggest that they get out of professional politics.
Thank you for helping me out here. And really, I have basically just one very, very simple question for you. It should be a very quick answer. How did this happen?
By 1,000 people cut.
Okay, that's what I figured. I know it wasn't going to be a quick answer. So my first question about this is, and maybe this is jumping ahead, I don't know, but one of the things that I really found shocking is that, like, the narrative that was spun around the job that Joe Biden did during his presidency these last 4 years was that it was a failure, whereas much of the statistics and metrics go against that, say that there are a lot of successes. How was that narrative able to be spun against the facts?
How much time do you have? No, I'm just kidding. There's a couple of different answers here, but there are a few direct ones.
Okay.
First and foremost, we are definitely living in an era of total information. And what I mean by that is there's a real difference between access to knowledge and access to information. We have information everywhere, and a lot of it is not accurate. And so with the advent of social media over the last 20 years, you've seen people sort of go to their corners and they consume media that agrees with their worldview. And they're not necessarily exposed to facts and figures that disagree with their worldview at all. And so all of these information bubbles exist depending on what your personal life experience is. And it depends on what kind of media you're consuming. So that's number one. Number two, there were real economic issues stemming from the pandemic that were never going to be addressed in just a year. Nothing was going to be fixed in 365 days, but that's kind of what people were expecting going into this new presidential term, right? The third, yes, the United States of America is still battling a lot of its demons from its inception. We're still battling racism in this country. We're still battling sexism in this country. We're still battling income inequality. We're battling how people have access to education and healthcare and services. So things that have been, plaguing the union since its founding do get better over time, but it doesn't mean that some of the underlying issues don't still exist. So between the information environment that people find themselves in, the way both campaigns played out, the economy and other issues that stemmed from the pandemic in 2020, and then honest to goodness structural issues that the United States is still facing. There are about 30 subheaders under all four of those categories that lead us to the answer of how this election happened. But those are the main ideas that you really need to look into if you want to know exactly what happened in this election.
All right. So let's just say you had to explain this to somebody in roughly 20 minutes. Where would you start? Because that seemed like a big question that I asked right off the bat. So where would you start to explain what happened to somebody? Now, before you answer that, I just want to preface this by saying, we both vote blue. We're Democrats. So we are looking at this from the perspective of the losing campaign, unfortunately. So
Sure. Well, I mean, obviously, I'm not unbiased, but even an objective observer would say that the information environment is very important here. And I don't want to get too technical, but a number of years ago, actually in the 2008 campaign, Democrats perfected something called micro-targeting. And I'm not sure if you've heard that term before, but essentially what it means is you go very deep into communities where you have support. So you can do that by door knocking. You can do that through digital ads. You can do it through points on television commercials. You can do it by phone banking. There's a lot of ways that you can perform voter contact. And Democrats for a long time have been very good at this micro-targeting. We go into these communities. We do a number of forms of voter contact. And then during persuasion, which is what you would normally think a campaign is, where you're telling them, hey, here's our policy ideas. Here's why you should vote for us, right? That's called persuasion. Once you've done all that voter contact and you've moved into what's called GOTV, which stands for Get Out the Vote, which in normal times used to be pretty much 4 days before Election Day, you then take all that persuasion work you did and then you bring it all into a head and you turn out your vote, right, on Election Day. Democrats were very good at this. We were very good at bringing in our base. We were very good at appealing to independents. We were very good at this micro-targeting. The information environment has changed. TV audiences are down, right? Digital is up, but so are non-traditional forms of communication. This podcast, for instance, other podcasts, YouTube shows, TikTok has obviously been a huge one over the last 4 years that has totally changed the game. And if there's anything that I'll give, the Republicans credit for it, and honestly, it's MAGA, it's not like the Republican Party writ large. They were very good at using these non-traditional forms of information delivery to run campaigns. And meanwhile, the Democrats were very formulaic in how they reached their voters and how they reached their audiences. All of those metrics have been blown out of the water. And this was the first year that happened. If you look at all the key economic indicators over the last 4 years, in any other election year, in any other universe, especially on Earth 2, right, that absolutely would have brought us over the line. Donald Trump is a very unique political figure where he completely, blows norms out of the water. And that includes how information is delivered to voters. So if there is one thing that I would start with, I would say that the information environment in the United States of America has changed drastically. Donald Trump took advantage of that. The Democrats were too late by the time they woke up to it, because what they were doing was relying on their good policy to be good politics. And in the past, that had worked. In 2024, that did not work.
Now, that's funny that you said, because that was actually a question I was going to ask you earlier, where it seemed that, to me, as an outsider, as just a normal guy who follows politics loosely, that it was the Democrats who were more media savvy, and it seemed to have shifted. But I know you say the way that information is dispersed to people is different now. But would you also say that it's there's more misinformation purposely, put out there as well?
Fortunately, yes. I'm also a lawyer, so I'll try not to get too technical here. But there was something called the equal time rule, which basically got blown out of the water back during the George H.W. Bush administration back in the early 90s. And what that did was it allowed for the advent of Fox News. So Fox News, funny enough, their tagline is fair and balanced. It should be anything but, right? We know that they are a right-wing network. Unfortunately, what has also happened is right-wing misinformation has penetrated the online space in a big way. And the other thing is that you're seeing more and more foreign influence. It came out just a couple of months ago before the election that Russia was funneling a bunch of money to podcasters that were right-wing podcasters that had huge audiences. And essentially the podcaster said, he had no idea, that that's where the payment was coming from. One of them, his name is Tim Pool, has a huge audience, constantly bombards the internet with his talking points. It turned out not only were they right-wing talking points, they were Russian misinformation talking points. And they were paying him, wait for it, $4,000 a month for his podcast. $400,000 a month for his podcast. Meanwhile, you had all of this misinformation being injected, into the ether. Misinformation about the Israel-Palestine conflict, misinformation about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, misinformation about transgenderism, misinformation about crime, misinformation about costs, misinformation about inflation. So anything to inject chaos into our election and the conversation around our election is coming from very specific places. Now, if you go into a little more neutral territory, which still has, unfortunately, the ability to inject misinformation into the conversation, is people who don't have nefarious intent, but also are not equipped to correct the misinformation. A podcast like the Joe Rogan Experience, right? Yeah. Obviously, wildly popular, #1 podcast in the US. And he does have a very wide variety of guests on. And one of the controversies that you may have seen towards the end of the campaign is that, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump went on. Kamala Harris did not, because they could not work out the scheduling. Now, just keep in mind, Kamala Harris also was the sitting vice president. So her scheduling is a little bit different than your normal run-of-the-mill presidential candidate. She was not able to get on. Not entirely sure it would have made too much of a difference because, again, that type of podcast is not equipped to ask the questions that need to be asked in the right way. So even though he has, Jamie, the fact checker, information just sort of sits out there for people to absorb. And unless they go and they either Google the answer themselves, which can also be wrought, by the way, because unless you know where to look, you could just be receiving confirmation of misinformation, right? So we have a real issue with the information environment in this country when it comes to politics.
So to expand on that, do you think some of the misinformation that is allowed to be put out there comes from the fact that maybe people are exhausted for having to vet everything that they hear, let's say before they share it? So then somebody who maybe does want to be responsible, doesn't want to share misinformation, just doesn't do anything, and that allows more avenues for misinformation to get out there?
Absolutely. There's total saturation. There's psychological research now that the little notification you get from your social media, whether that's on, TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, now known as X, lights up the same part of your brain that heroin would. So this is now an addiction that most people around the world have. Most of the time, it's not a debilitating addiction. It doesn't interfere with their daily life, but it does interfere with the way that they think. And
That's
so if you're, one of the big controversies last year and 2 years ago was whether or not we should ban TikTok in the United States of America. And it actually was a bipartisan bill offered by the China Committee through Congress, which was a bipartisan committee, which basically said TikTok's algorithm is controlled by a foreign government. It's controlled by the CCCP of China. And they are basically radicalizing our youth to think bad things about the U.S. There's also some really scary research about some of the things that they may or may not have been doing with TikTok. One of the things that was reported in open source media is that if you downloaded TikTok on your phone, and of course, even me being a lawyer, when you download an app, do you read every single term of service when you say, okay, yes, I agree, I want it downloaded? No, of course not. Nobody does, not even lawyers, right? So in the term of service for TikTok, it obviously lays out some pretty dangerous stuff. If you have a smart thermostat in your home, right, TikTok is actually able to connect to your smart thermostat through your Wi-Fi. And then they're able to place bugs into the grid through your smart thermostat. Right? So that is obviously a national security concern. Don't let it keep you up at night. Our government is on it, right? But why would we expose most of our citizenry, let alone our youth, to that type of nefariousness through a social media app? Unfortunately, in the middle of the campaign, Donald Trump, who was dead set against TikTok, when he started to run, got contacted by, one of the people who was funding it, made a huge donation to his campaign. And the next day he changed his mind. He said, I'm pro TikTok. He ordered all the Republicans in Congress to support TikTok. The bill failed, and we still have TikTok, which is still the same national security threat that it always was. But here we are, right? And I want to be clear that even though I'm partisan, I don't think that I won't necessarily refer to them as Democrats, but I'll refer to them as the left or the far left. I don't think they're immune from the misinformation environment. And we've seen that a lot, especially in this election with the Israel-Palestine conflict. And we see it a lot with the crime conversation. So, I don't like both siderism for most things, but in this particular scenario, the information environment is the fault of both parties.
The far, you would say more the far left, far right.
The extremes on both parties. The problem is that the extreme on the right has become the mainstream. So that is now the Republican Party. It is now the Trump Party. It is now the MAGA Party. It is no longer the party of Mike Pence and Paul Ryan and John McCain and Mitt Romney. It is the Donald Trump Party. So that extreme has become mainstream on the right. The left, they're still battling each other. We have a lot of internal wars over progressive versus centrism versus moderate, but we're still kind of working those questions out. There's no question at this point where the Republican Party has settled.
Right, which is crazy to me when Mitt Romney has to be the moral compass of your party. I feel like you're doing something wrong. But
so, in 2012, I was working for the Democratic State Committee in New Jersey during President Obama's reelection. And obviously I was just furious at Mitt Romney, right? And I went to the convention in Charlotte for Obama, and we worked our hearts out, and, we were just overjoyed that he had defeated, the evil policies of Mitt Romney. The problem is that even though we didn't like Mitt Romney's policies, never once did we fear for the Republic itself if he were to be elected.
Right.
And never did we ever think that he personally lacked the character or the thoughtfulness to be the president, right? We just disagreed with his policies. Just about 6 months ago, I had to take a very last minute flight to Boston to meet a client because something was really popping off up there. There was literally one seat left on the plane for me to get where I needed to be on time, and it was in first class. So my client had to shell out. And when I get on the plane, who am I seated immediately next to? Mitt Romney. And, you try not to bother elected officials when they're in an enclosed space, right? And so, didn't really try to pay much attention when we were on the plane. But when we got off, I went over to him and I just said, it's a pleasure to meet you. And, I really respect how you've been speaking truth to power over the last, couple of years. And I know that's not easy to do. And I'm sorry to see you go. I wish you were going to continue serving. And he was very kind and very nice. And we took a quick selfie. And when I posted it on social media, I said, if you had told me in 2012 that I would have been really excited to share a row with Mitt Romney on a plane, I would have said that you were crazy. But I hope one day I make it into one of the binders. And for those of you not familiar with that reference, back when Mitt Romney was debating then President Obama, President Obama accused him of, sort of not elevating women in places of business. And Mitt Romney proceeded to say that they had binders and binders of qualified women during their campaign process. And of course, that became one of the first memes ever in existence, was binders full of women. So that was a particularly funny moment in my life to sit next to him.
Wow, that's a great story. Yeah, it's mind-boggling how we got from there to here. And one thing I do say, and this is a little off topic, but I always relate to like, I don't know, like when Obama and John McCain ran against each other, I felt really good about the country, because even though like a Democrat, John McCain was a great man. And I felt like, I'm like, wow, like we have two great candidates. And then it's just now to see like where we're at now is just, I don't know. It kind of, it leaves me speechless. I don't even know what to say to that. And, but
yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. And we've known each other since high school.
Yes.
And I've been a political nerd since the womb. Like I was the one running around giving everybody voter registration forms for their 18th birthday present. And I was the one making my, sixth grade social studies teacher host a mock debate for the presidential election in 1992, right? Like
Right.
that's who I've always been. And I've always revered the process, whatever warts it may have, because it has warts. It is not a perfect process by any stretch of the imagination. And now I'm really going to nerd out. But if you've ever looked really closely at a dollar bill, there's a pyramid on the dollar bill with an eye of the pyramid at the very top. And above it, it says Annuit Coeptus. And what that essentially means is that he favors our undertaking. And any of you West Wing fans out there, I'm sure you've seen the episode where they get into this sort of in detail. It's that in order to form a more perfect union, right, which is the beginning of the beginning words of our Constitution, we acknowledge that we are not yet perfect, nor will we ever be, but we should be working towards that. And unfortunately, with Donald Trump's introduction into, the body politic for the last 8 years, we have taken an extraordinary step back in that purpose. And for people like me in particular, it's really hurtful because pretty much all the way up until 2016, I thought we were working towards that more perfect union.
That's great. I mean, I completely understand that because I feel the same exact way. 2016, prior to 2016, I was really naive to just the fact that there was still so much racism and sexism. And at the time, I was in a construction union, and I cannot tell you how many times, like, I'm convinced Hillary Clinton didn't win because she was a woman. From my personal experience and what I actually heard men I worked with say, union men who would vote against their own, their own interests simply for the fact that, and I would hear them say the words, "A woman can't be president," in 2016, and it blew my mind. It still does. Like I was
really
very naive.
Frustrating. It was frustrating to hear people call Kamala Harris unqualified, right?
I know.
This is a woman who went to Howard University, which is not an easy school. It's an HBCU. She then put herself through law school. She was a district attorney for a decade. She then was the attorney general of one of the largest states in the union for a decade. She then got elected to be United States Senator and then served as vice president for almost 4 years. And if you're going to look me in the face and tell me that Kamala Harris is unqualified, you better have a better resume than that, right?
Right.
So unfortunately, I think those are the places where racism and misogyny really, reared their ugly heads. MAGA writ large, and this is a generalization, call Democrats the party of the elites is really frustrating to me because, as I just said, Kamala Harris went to an HBCU. Biden, went to a state school. Yes, they both went to law school after that, but J.D. Vance went to an Ivy League school, though he did not have an easy upbringing, right? Obviously, Donald Trump was born with, forget a silver spoon, a platinum spoon in his mouth and went to an Ivy League school. Obviously, same thing with all of his kids. Donald Trump is going to have more billionaires in his cabinet than ever in history. You've got United States senators like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley calling Democrats, elitists, and then positioning themselves as the, men of the working people. They both have degrees from Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford and right. And by the way, that's not a bad thing. I know there's a conversation, that's happening in our elite academic institutions around the country about, the type of education that is being provided and the type of diversity of thought that is happening, on these campuses. And that's a healthy conversation that we should be having. But to pretend that you are not from an elite status when, your opponents actually are not,
Right.
It's frustrating to me.
It's insulting too, honestly.
Barack Obama, raised by a single mother, came from almost nothing, worked his way up to go to the Ivy Leagues. Same thing with Bill Clinton. Came from a single mother, didn't have a pot to piss in when he was, younger, was really a working man, happened to be brilliant, sort of, rose up through the ranks, went to, Ivy League school and then, ran for office. And, personal failings aside, goes back to the misinformation we were talking about, the fact that, the two people who were not elite were viewed as the elite candidates, and the two people who were elite thought to be the candidates of the working man. That doesn't really compute in a normal information environment.
Yeah, I mean, wow, you said that terrifically. Because, yeah, I don't get that either, and that makes a lot of sense with the amount of misinformation that is just out there. It twists everything. It's like living in bizarro world.
And that's not to let Democrats off the hook. And I might be jumping the gun on one of your next questions, but yes, there was a misinformation problem. Yes, there was a messenger problem because we didn't go everywhere, we needed to. I don't believe policy was the problem because when you asked voters what they thought about certain issues, more than 70% of the time, you were getting people agreeing with what the Democratic policy was, as long as they didn't know that it was a Democratic policy. And that's a really important shift that has happened to our electorate. Now, on the flip side, inflation was debilitating for a lot of people coming out of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And things that the Biden-Harris administration did certainly helped different industries and people come out of the pandemic. The American Rescue Plan, which was started under the Trump administration, by the way,
right,
is what they blamed for inflation because folks were getting either $1,000 or $2,500 checks once, right?
Right.
If they had lost their job during COVID. Then you looked at the Chips and Science Act, which helped, bring that technology and jobs back to the U.S. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed in 2022, you actually saw inflation sort of continue all the way down, and that, is until today is continuing down and coming down. The average price of eggs right now is somewhere around $2.95, which is lower than it was before the pandemic hit in 2019. But
people went crazy for the price of eggs.
It really was high. And there was also a shortage due to an H1N1 breakout, earlier in 2021, which, by the way, it sounds like we're about to face again. So everybody who was pissed at the price of eggs 3 years ago, brace yourself because it's coming back, right?
Right.
Everybody was pissed at the price of gas, right? Well, the Biden-Harris administration went in there and essentially broke OPEC. And we are now creating and generating more energy in the United States than we ever have in history. So for President Trump, to come in and say, we're going to drill, baby, drill, and we're going to produce more oil, and we're going to produce more energy. Well, we're already doing that. It's just that nobody believes it because they were paying higher prices at the gas pump. But that's for a variety of reasons. Donald Trump, before he left office, went and created a deal with Saudi Arabia and Putin. He even tweeted about it. You can go out and you can look it up yourselves, where the oil company owners were all bitching and moaning during COVID that they were losing so much money, that he created this agreement between all of them so that they would stop production, so that it would be scarce in the U.S., so that prices would go back up, so that the investors and the stockholders in the oil companies wouldn't lose any money. And obviously that sustained into the Biden administration until they were able to unpack it with legislation. Then, of course, you have the infrastructure bill, which started more than 66,000 projects, which had been neglected for over 50 years in this country. And we had a true infrastructure revolution in this country under the Biden-Harris administration. And then if you look at all of the consumer protection measures that this administration put into place, including my personal friend, Secretary Pete Buttigieg, Department of Transportation, everything that he protected consumers from in the airline industry, in the rail industry, it just never made its way into the psyche of the voter, because it turns out that even though we have record unemployment, the goal of the Fed usually says that unemployment should be about 4% to keep the balance in the United States. Right now, we're sub 2% in unemployment, which is basically, in a developed nation, full employment. But prices are still high. The question is why? Greedflation.
I've tried to make this point to so many people, is that it's not inflation when companies are making record profits. It's greed.
That's right.
Why do you think is that part of a misinformation thing, or why are you thinking that doesn't resonate with people?
Yes, there's some information, and Trump was very successful at driving that point home with voters, saying prices are high and it's Joe Biden's fault. And they just kept hammering that home pretty much every day. Democrats were out here sort of giving, an economic lesson about transitory inflation and stagnation and greedflation, and using a bunch of SAT words to, like, what you said, like a bunch of union workers at a site who are basically like, well, that's great, I don't care what it is you're trying to tell me about macro and microeconomics, lower the cost of my gas, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
even though policies were being passed to do that, it's kind of like Democrats were talking past voters, right? And they were saying, why don't you get this? Why don't you
Right.
understand this, right? And we were blaming the voter instead of showing them how it worked. Now, there was only so much we could do in the limited time frame between 22 and 24 to reduce the what I call the greedflation. Once the cost of goods, COGS, right, comes down, normally what a business would do is they would pass that savings onto the consumer. That didn't happen in the last 2 years because they were making record profits. Obviously, they were hurt through the pandemic because of the supply chain shortages. But then once those opened up and they were able to get those goods at a reasonable price again, they never passed the same savings on to the consumer. So they would report back to their stockholders the record profits, and the stock price would go through the roof, which is why you saw such extraordinary historic numbers in the stock market. But the price of the goods to the consumer never went down.
Right.
What's frustrating for someone like me, who's a political communicator, is I was screaming at the top of my lungs on TV that this was the case. And by the way, with the introduction of tariffs, it's about to get much, much, much worse.
Yeah, that seems to me like just, simple logic, but apparently that's not something that resonates either. Not that I want to cut short this topic, but there's a couple other things I want to talk about the election, and to really, obviously not going to get to the bottom of this in just a short amount of time, but it is good to talk about some of these things. One of the main things that I think voters were worried about was immigration, the security of the borders. I want to ask you a question about the Biden administration. It's kind of a two-part question here. Is it fair to say that, obviously no administration is perfect, is it fair to say that it's actually a three-part question. The Biden administration was, their weak suit, if anything, was how they handled immigration. Do you think it was a direct response to how far Donald Trump had wanted to take it originally, and that we just kind of overcompensated without realizing the consequences? And finally, why wasn't more made of the fact that there was an immigration bill that was a bipartisan bill that was ready to be passed? Even Mitch McConnell was on board with it until Donald Trump shot it down because he wanted to be able to use he didn't want immigration to get fixed under Biden. He wanted to be able to use it as a talking point.
Yeah. A lot of what you said is accurate. The short answer is it comes down to a fundamental difference in theory, right? So if you take Republicans or conservatives sort of in a vacuum, right? They believe that immigration dilutes Americanism. And I'm talking about illegal immigration or undocumented, right?
Right.
And they believe that it should be stopped at all costs. Even if you take the nefariousness out of it and don't assign racism or anything like that, they believe we are a country, we have borders, we are to stop illegal immigration at all costs. Democrats, fundamentally, the ones who believe that we also should have a border, there is absolutely a strain, and I will call them out, of progressives that identify as Democrats who literally don't believe in a border. And I personally fight them every day. And I want them to shut up and go away and not be part of my party, right?
Right.
But not so fast, because years ago, there was something called the Gang of Eight, which was a bipartisan commission. I believe it was under Obama, of legislators that came out and said, okay, here's how we're going to start to fix our immigration system. It's overloaded. Obviously, there's not a ton of immigrants coming from Ireland and Italy anymore. They're now coming from South and Central America. We need to adjust our formulas. Are we recruiting unskilled workers to come here and work in agriculture? Are we recruiting high-skilled workers to come on H-1B visas? That's like, the highly technical people that will come in and work on AI projects and things like that, right? Let's say there's some agreement on that legal immigration part. The Gang of Eight recommended that this happen. And unfortunately, the Republicans blew it up. They wouldn't pass it. It went down the tubes. And at that point, Democrats, who generally are more friendly to the undocumented community, especially DACA, which are children that were brought here illegally when they were very little through no fault of their own by their parents, were granted a citizenship status, not full citizenship, but a status when they came over under the second Obama administration. So you've got sort of like all these different categories of immigration. On the Republican side, their answer is no, we want to limit it as much as possible. On the Democratic side, once again, it's an academic answer, right? You've got something called affirmative asylum and defensive asylum. And a lot of people don't know that those two things exist. If you show up from Mexico to a border crossing and you say to the immigration officer, I want to declare asylum, right? I am being hunted by my local police chief, and I have been raped by my, professor who's also the mayor in town, right? And I am, or I ran for office against the incumbent party and now they want to kill me, right? You come and you tell the immigration officer, I am asserting affirmative asylum and I want to come into the country. That is not illegal. You get something called a return date because we don't have the resources to hear every single one of those that comes through one of our ports of entry. And we say, okay, you come back on, in 6 months, we're going to have a hearing. We're going to talk about your credible fear of going back to your home country, and we'll decide whether or not you will get temporary or permanent status in our country. That's affirmative asylum.
Okay.
There's also something called defensive asylum, which is what a lot of the undocumented immigrants are right now that Democrats believe in and Republicans don't. If you are brought here by a coyote, let's say you pay, you're in Honduras and you pay $10,000, $15,000 for basically a human trafficker to get you across the border because you want to get out of your country. And then you get here and you have some kind of sanctuary, in a church. You've sort of made it across the, river. You snuck in. You were not met by an immigration official. You're just literally living here illegally.
Mm-hmm.
If you are then caught, you can claim defensive asylum. It essentially means, no, I'm not supposed to be here. I know I came here illegally, but I'm still asserting that I'm in danger in my home country. I was starving in my home country. My brother was killed in my home country. The mayor is after me. Whatever your claim is, once you're caught, you can assert defensive asylum, right? So first and foremost, we need to understand in the debate that those two things are legal to assert in the United States of America. They are law. And the Republicans made it seem like both of those things were illegal. It is not illegal to come to the border and try to claim asylum. Now, having said that and having been really academic about that answer, moving into what you actually asked me, why was immigration not made more of an issue? It was by both sides. The Kamala Harris campaign must have spent over $200 million on ads saying we had a fix. It wasn't perfect, but we had a fix. We had a bill. It was bipartisan. We tried to address these things, and Donald Trump blew it out of the water, mainly because he wanted to run on the issue. It fell on deaf ears completely. And unfortunately, do you want to know why? Because Donald Trump ran a much more effective ad about transgenderism. And you may or may not have seen this on your TV, but he ran an ad that said, Kamala Harris is for they, them. Donald Trump is for you. And it was about her answer at an ACLU forum 5 or 6 years ago. It had nothing to do with this election, where she was asked about sexual reassignment surgery in California jails for, undocumented immigrants. And that was the law in California. Regardless of whether or not you thought it should be the law, that is what was passed and signed in California. And as Attorney General, she is charged with enforcing the laws, right? She doesn't get to make law herself. So she had to answer in the affirmative. Unfortunately, he took that, and that became the issue of the election, and no other issue broke through as much as we were trying to tell voters the truth about immigration. So neither party has been perfect on this issue. The Democrats really lost an opportunity to message on it this time around.
That ad you were talking about, I know exactly what you're talking about. I remember it, and I was just like, wow. I'm still kind of shocked. It's just because I don't know. I could tell, or I shouldn't say I could tell, but just watching that, when I see something like that, I have to say to myself, like, what's the context around this clip? But it seems like that's not what most people do. Does that go back to what I was talking about, the fatigue of just having to vet every information source? I don't understand it. I don't even, there's not even really a question there, I guess. I just don't understand that at all.
There's again, just because I'm a political nerd, there's a movie called The American President. Like Michael Douglas plays the the president, and he's talking to Michael J. Fox, who's one of his aides. And this is a line that really rings true, written by Aaron Sorkin, who also wrote The West Wing.
West Wing, yeah.
Where the president is complaining that everybody is talking about, that he's dating Sidney Ellen Wade, the education lobbyist, right? He's really, getting in his feels there and bitching and moaning. And Michael J. Fox says to him, Mr. President, people don't care about your life. They care about their own. And I think that's what's happening in terms of how elected officials and candidates are messaging to voters or to unregistered voters yet and trying to convince them to register. A lot of times, elected officials, candidates, politicians will talk about, sort of lofty things, right? But they're not necessarily talking about what's happening to you in your life at that moment. And that's because people are busy. I gave remarks a couple of months ago about what a manufactured event looks like versus a drop-in. And you've probably seen drop-ins since you started paying attention to politics. An elected official or a candidate will go to a diner, right, and shake hands and talk to seniors and, hold and post pictures for babies and stuff like that. That's a drop-in, right? A manufactured campaign event is what Donald Trump did at McDonald's this last time around. He had his team totally clear the McDonald's. There were no real customers there. The place had been cited for all kinds of workplace violations. The union had been crushed. Like, it was just a terrible scenario. But he got a ton of eyes on him because he pulled the stunt, right? Whereas somebody just, Kamala Harris walking into a diner and, ordering donuts like the everyman, which she does all the time because she has a sweet tooth, right? For whatever reason, you can call it sexism, you can call it misogyny, you can call it racism. It did not resonate with voters in the same way that the stunt by Donald Trump did, right? And one of the reasons for that is because people don't care about your life. They care about their own. And when they can't put food on the table and everything at Walmart costs twice as much, and they're having a problem with their kid's teacher and their car just broke down and their boss is being an asshole and everything is going on in their life, they don't really have time to sit down and listen to the Daily from the New York Times, right? So they are consuming their information while maybe they're scrolling TikTok for 15 minutes before they fall asleep at night to relax, right? And so once again, there's this question about the misinformation environment. If people are not tuned in to what you're saying, you're never going to reach them.
Why wasn't January 6th just a dead stop as far as Trump ever coming back?
Two reasons. Number one, Attorney General Merrick Garland did not do what he needed to do quick enough. He should have essentially started prosecuting that almost immediately and didn't. He sort of hemmed and hawed because there was this question around, does it look like the politicization of the DOJ? And the second reason is that the Republicans in the United States Senate were complete cowards. Complete cowards. Mitch McConnell could have put a stop to this. He could have voted to remove instead of acquit after Donald Trump was impeached, not once, but twice by the House of Representatives. And then the 14th Amendment would have triggered and he would not have been permitted to be on the ballot for president. But Lisa Murkowski and Mitt Romney, unfortunately, my airplane friend, and Mitch McConnell and the rest of them did not grow a pair when they needed to and vote to remove him. And their justification was that the voters should decide. Well, unfortunately, the voters, love them as I do, have the attention span of a ladybug. And so we had already moved on 20 crises since January 6th. And even though it was the worst domestic assault on the U.S. since the War of 1812, it was quickly forgotten, especially in this 24-hour news cycle media environment. And then, unfortunately, Donald Trump was successful in politicizing it and basically saying, if you, mention January 6th, it's a liberal lie. And that stuff. And unfortunately, once again, people care about their own lives. They don't care about yours. And even though it was an assault on democracy and on the republic, it did not directly affect them because it was not successful, right? Think for a minute if January 6th had been successful, right? And they prevented the peaceful transfer of power. Maybe, that would have affected a few more people. But in this scenario, because it was tamped down and because it was prevented, even though it was an absolute atrocity, really did not have the staying power in the political lexicon that it should have. You also, unfortunately, had the Supreme Court, which has been unfortunately trending conservative since the year 2000, essentially give the president immunity for almost everything he does as an official act, which is wildly outside the bounds of what the framers intended. But that's probably a whole podcast in and of itself.
I like to, every time I say, like, it's nothing shocks me anymore. I have to admit the January 6th really not affecting Trump from winning.
Yeah, I was in DC that day. I didn't appreciate it. I'm
really?
lucky that I was not on the Hill, but there were a lot of things happening with a number of my clients who had gotten elected to Congress, where we were working on various things at the DNC. Obviously, there were pipe bombs found at the DNC. Never got to the bottom of who planted them there. And so by the time I got home that night, I was pretty distraught.
I bet. Wow. I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I had friends who were texting me who weren't sure if they were going to make it out that day. So it was as awful, as it looked on TV. And it'll be frustrating for a long time as to why that wasn't a bigger issue in this election. But there were a lot of really major catastrophes that just did not break through. Project 2025, which we haven't addressed yet, was
that's
written down, bound, and put out for all to see. And when we started calling them on what was physically written in it, all they did was throw up their hands and say, we don't really know what that is. And yet we were like, are you kidding me? All of your advisors drafted it. Like, of course you know what it is. I'm sorry. Like, I must have slipped the time-space continuum. Like, how are people not paying attention to this? And then you had, networks like CNN, funny enough, who constantly get tagged as liberal media by the right, fact-checking Democrats when they would go on and talk about Project 2025. And they would say, well, we have to be fair. Donald Trump says that he disavows Project 2025. And we would just all, sit there with our mouths agape being like, what are you talking about? Like, of course this is his plan, right? And now, of course, that we're in the transition, we see that he has hired all the authors of Project 2025. Yeah. Most of the plans in 2025 have been prepared as day one executive orders, right? So when you think about how dangerous this is for the social progress of our country, abortion obviously has already, been put into major danger in this country. It's probably looking at even more restrictions on day one. Birth control is in danger. Marriage equality is in danger. Education funding is in danger. Some of our treaties are in danger. In fact, you even had a group of senators talk about overturning Loving v. Virginia. Loving v. Virginia is a landmark United States Supreme Court case which legalized interracial marriage. Like, this is insanity to me that we are talking about going back to that kind of time. We could not get the voters to care. There's
so much that you're saying that is just, as you're saying it, it's on my, I want to say it where it's like, it feels like people are voting for a time machine and not a good way, like regressing. And I don't get that.
It's frustrating. And I don't want to overstate what the swing was. I know I had sent you this really quick snapshot analysis of what happened in the election. Yes. And one of the things that you'll see in there is that the swing was not as drastic as the Trump transition is making it out to be. Yes. I would in no way, in no universe, call what Donald Trump has a mandate. Hillary Clinton in 2016 won the popular vote by around 2.6%, which, came out to like a couple million votes. Joe Biden won the popular vote by like 4.5%. In this most recent election, Donald Trump won the vote by 1.2%. This is going to be probably the smallest margin of victory in history of the United States of America. The only one that might wind up being smaller is Kennedy-Nixon in 1960. But we haven't actually finished counting all the votes, so we'll know when we do. In 4 of the 7 battleground states, Kamala Harris received more votes than Joe Biden did in 2020. In the remaining 3 battleground states, Kamala Harris received about the same number of votes. What happened was that a lot more people came out and bullet voted for Donald Trump. What does that mean? It means they had not come out before, they were an unlikely voter, or maybe they only voted in 2020. They punched the ticket for Donald Trump. They didn't fill out any of the down ballot races and left the voting booth. So Kamala Harris received more votes than Donald Trump did in either 2016 or 2020. It's just that this year he was able to draw out more voters to only vote for him, which is why you didn't see the slaughtered down ballot. Now, the Democrats lost the Senate, so that might seem like cognitive dissonance.
Right.
But a lot of those seats were hyper-localized. We also picked up seats that we weren't supposed to, like Ruben Gallego in Arizona was a phenomenal candidate. Alyssa Slotkin in Michigan was a phenomenal candidate. But then you had working class senators like Sherrod Brown and Bob Casey out of Ohio and Pennsylvania who lost their elections to carpetbagging dilettantes. And, you know, you sort of sit there and you're like, this math ain't mathin'.
Right.
You know? And so the election, there isn't really an easy explanation for this election. If you think about what happened in North Carolina, Donald Trump won at the top of the ticket, and then Democrats won everything else down ballot, including flipping the legislature. They won the attorney general. They won the governor, although the Republican gubernatorial candidate in North Carolina was particularly bonkers. You may or may not remember him as self-identifying as a black Nazi. So he is, you know, a special case.
Right.
But the House, where Republicans were expected to have a much larger margin, they're down to like 2, 3, 4 seats. And if President Trump keeps plucking members of the House out for his administration, you might see a Speaker Hakeem Jeffries sooner rather than later, right? Because he's the minority leader. So there is not a one-size-fits-all explanation for this election. I think historians are going to be researching it for a long time to come.
Okay, so I want to end with this. Is there a chance that Democrats will show out in 2 years during midterms? And going forward, what do you think Democrats need to focus on going forward as far as these big presidential elections? Because everything has changed. To me, as an outsider, that's what I see. You're not playing by the same rules anymore.
So historically, the party that is not in power does well in the midterm elections. And so I am expecting increased turnout in 2026, especially if Trump is successful in implementing some of the policies that he says he's going to, especially tariffs, which are going to be really hard on the consumer. There's rumors right now of a flat tax, which is really, really, really hard on lower income families because it's more of a consumption tax than an income tax. And it's regressive, not progressive. And I won't nerd out. You can look it up if you don't know what that means. So if he's successful in basically trading away Ukraine to Russia and Russia doesn't stop at Ukraine, I think you're going to see a backlash to that. Depending on what happens with the Israel-Palestine conflict, depending on what happens with women's health care and just health care in general over the next 2 years, I think you're going to see a very large backlash. You know, one of the most concerning things is that, you know, Medicaid is done away with, and Medicare and Social Security are drastically changed. If they repeal Obamacare, which is also known as the Affordable Care Act, 40 million Americans are going to lose their health care outright. We're going to see a renewal of pre-existing conditions. Kids are not going to be able to stay on their parents' health care until they're 26. And so that is going to be a huge hit to the economy. If all of this instability happens at a quick pace, you're also going to see the speculators and the market come down a little bit, even though the market usually responds positively to tax cuts and to deregulation. Unfortunately, the bill comes due and you have to pay the piper. And people get nervous, and you're going to see that reflected in the market. So people's 401ks are going to suffer. You know who aren't going to suffer? Billionaires and multimillionaires, which was sort of the entire purpose of this campaign, right? You know, going forward, what do Democrats have to do? We still have to harp on the good policies we put in place. There was a report issued this morning that Thanksgiving, a full Thanksgiving meal is going to cost less today than it has over the last 10 years, right? And that's because of the measures that we put into place over the last 4 years. So we have to find a better way to message that to voters. But there are real demons that the Democratic Party is going to have to deal with. One of the things that's very unpopular that I constantly harp on is that bail reform in its current iteration has been a major failure in blue cities, in the governance of the blue cities. Its intention, however good, was to make up for systemic racism in our criminal justice system. has not been executed properly. Every time we went from we need to correct this injustices to we shouldn't actually enforce the law, right? And those
Right.
those are two entirely different scenarios that Democrats put their heads in the sand on. You're in New York City and you forgot your deodorant and you walk into Duane Reade and you have to ask someone to unlock the deodorant, right? That's a
Right.
Republican campaign ad right there. So
Right.
even though we come out and we say, hey, crime is down, the FBI statistics said that there's been like way less murders, right?
Mhm.
That's not their personal lived experience. And as much as we come at voters with statistics, we have to acknowledge what it is they're seeing with their own two eyes day to day. And that's one of them, right? The defund the police movement was extraordinarily harmful to the Democratic brand. And even
Right.
though it stemmed from a horrendous incident, right,
Mhm.
that we all acknowledge should never have happened, the overreaction to it was incorrect. And that's something that Democrats still have not crawled out from under. Whether we like it or not, whether it's fair or not, we have to acknowledge head on that we have been painted as the party of elites because we defended the campus protests, you know, during the beginning of the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Right.
And we did not face that issue head on, regardless of which side, you know, you are on in that conflict. There are things that are acceptable to voters in the United States, and lawlessness is not one of them. So when we say we're no longer going to prosecute fare evaders and turnstile jumpers, and then people get attacked on the subway and they can't use public transportation to get to their place of business, that is going to reflect poorly on the party that is asking for those policies, right? So even though they may be in theory, you know, good policies and the incidence may be low, it is not enough to tell someone that they're not experiencing what they are in their daily life. So
Right.
Democrats do have to look inward on a couple of these very unpopular policies. One of the others that, you know, perpetrated into the, you know, daily lexicon because of that Trump ad that we talked about earlier was the conversation around transgendered individuals and whether or not they should be permitted to participate in women's sports. And regardless of where you come down on that issue, you have to allow people the ability to talk about it. And Democrats have not done that over the last 4 years. Basically, writ large, I'm actually not talking about me and a couple of other, you know, members of my party who have spoken freely about this issue, right? They're basically canceled and told that they're bigots. And, you know, you
Right.
can't have an opinion on this because you're not a member of the community, right?
Mhm.
All progress in the U.S. has been incremental, and you have to give people space to catch up to what you know is the right moral thing to do. You know, MLK Jr. said it best, where the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. When you force people to come to your side on something before they understand it, you're going to get a negative result. And unfortunately, this regression is the price of the progress that we've seen over the last 15 years. So we have to combat the misinformation head on. We have to make sure we are telling the voters about the policies that are going to make their lives better. We have to show those results, but we also have to confront our own demons and make sure that we give people space to catch up to where we are.
One last question. I thought about that really quick while you were saying this. In 2 years, do you think it's going to be too little, too late? You think a lot of damage is going to be done and it's going to take us a long time to recover from?
Personally, I do. Yes, I think that there are very little checks and balances on the Trump presidency right now.
Right.
One glimmer of hope. I think it is very interesting that the Matt Gaetz nomination was beat back before it sort of got off its feet. A number of people that Trump has nominated for these cabinet positions, like Tulsi Gabbard for DNI, RFK Jr. to HHS,
Gosh.
Pete Hegseth to DOD, and Gates, you know, to DOJ. One is worse than the other. I literally can't rank how horrible they are.
I know.
Although, like, I might give, you know, Gates the nod on that one because sounds like he's a pedophile rapist who pays
he's
people on
awful.
Venmo to have sex with underage girls, right? So the fact that the Senate showed a little bit of spine to beat that nomination back
Right.
gives me maybe some unwarranted, but some hope to say, okay, the framers intended, it says right in the Constitution that the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives are a check on the executive, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you've got certain MAGA members of the House of Representatives out there saying, whatever dear leader Donald Trump wants, that's what we're going to do. You don't question him. We're here to push through his agenda, right? The Senate's not so easy. The Senate has a lot of individual personalities. They know that their constitutional role, regardless of whether or not they're from the same party, is to provide a check on the executive. It's right there in Article 1. It spells it out in plain old English.
Right.
And I think some of them are taking that duty really seriously. What I would do is I would look for how Mitch McConnell is acting over the next couple of weeks. I would look to see how Susan Collins of Maine is acting. I would look to see how Lisa Murkowski is acting of Alaska. These are Republicans who have shown an independent streak in the past. There's also a couple of other ones like Senator Langford, who was the author of that bipartisan immigration bill, who has come out and expressed some concern over the president's cabinet. So if there, the Senate shows some spine in providing a check on the executive, maybe we can mitigate some of the damage. If they don't, or if Elon Musk says he's going to primary them out if they don't 100% support Trump, which we have not gotten into in this conversation, but we are very much headed towards an oligarchy, which is how, Russia operates, where they hand over functions of government to private billionaires to run for their own benefit. We're seeing that right now live with the Trump nominations. If Elon Musk is successful in primarying these people out of their seats and they're replaced with loyalists, then it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to roll back the damage over the next 2 to 4 years.
Well, that's kind of depressing.
It is, but I'll tell you, I'm not done fighting until they haul me off to the Democrat camp. I will be here fighting the good fight, and a lot of other people are too.
Well, I was gonna say, hope maybe I don't know, maybe in 4 years, maybe we'll see you running. I don't know. I mean, you'll have my vote.
I know you do. I thought a long time ago that I'd want to run for office, especially when I was coming out of college and law school. But I've been doing this for 25 years now, and the more I do it, the more I like to be the guy counts on.
Right.
I like being behind the scenes and making sure that everything is set up in the right way and making sure that the communication is headed in the right way. And I like going on TV and beating people up. And you can't do that if you're an elected official. So I think I've found my calling as an operative and a strategist. Never say never. So
I will say this before I let you go. Some of the I see the Jersey face sometimes when I see you on TV and I see it. I'm like, oh, there's the Jersey.
It's hard to hide. I remember a number of years ago, I was on Laura Ingram's show on Fox, and I was raised Catholic. I wear my cross, and I went on the network, and they paired me with a gay Republican strategist, and we were talking about Chick-fil-A and the controversy over the donations that company had given to anti-LGBTQ organizations. And I remember at one point he was saying something so patently absurd that I just straight rolled my eyes in the middle of the segment. And obviously a lot of people on Twitter found that to be very funny. And that was the first time I became a GIF. So
I think I remember seeing that that posted, and I'm like, I know her.
Yeah, no, sometimes my face speaks out loud.
All right. Well, last thing. You're a Yankee fan. I'm a Mets fan. Juan Soto, where's he go?
You're a hater. Go Yankees.
I am a hater. He's going to be a Met.
Over my dead body.
Well, if you save America, you have Juan Soto.
Okay. That's a good deal.
All right. Great deal. Yeah. I can't thank you enough for doing this. I appreciate it. Thank you for being out there and saving America. You're a good inspiration to us all, and I always, my youngest daughter is very into politics, and we always tell her about you and stuff. So you're very appreciated in my household. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. And when you're done with your degree, let me know, and we'll start hiring you onto the campaigns.
All right, thanks. I mean, I'm pretty old, so I don't know if I'll be around by then, but who knows? All right, Jennifer, thank you again. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Off the top, 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 off the top. top. Off the top. Off the top.
Off the Top has been a production of Pod Media LLC. Thanks again for checking us out. Our theme song, Off the Top, was created by New Jersey hip-hop artist and producer extraordinaire Enrichment. Check him out on YouTube at Enrichment Beats. Peace.